So we are now going to cover two chapters in 1 week, but they're closely related. We'll cover chapter 7 in this series of lecture on microbial nutrition, ecology, and growth, and follow that with chapter 11, which is about controlling or methods to control microbial growth. So here's a quick outline for this chapter. We'll talk about what elements and nutrients microbes need to grow and why. And actually, as it turns out, when we're talking about the microbes in your body, they pretty much need the same things that you do. That's why they're there. They're getting their nutrients from you. We'll talk about patterns of microbial growth, and we'll talk about optimum conditions for growth. One of Carl Sagan's most famous quotes is that we are all made of star stuff. He said this because all the atoms, aside from hydrogen, are made in the hot and high pressure center of stars. It's beyond the scope of this course to discuss why, but some atoms or some elements are made in greater abundance than others, and this graph shows the universal abundance of different elements. It is no coincidence that the most abundant elements that build living things are also the most abundant elements in the universe. And this is another way you could consider us star stuff. What we are made of reflects what the universe is made of. So these arrows on this graph they're indicating the most abundant elements that make up living things. By weight, 99% of the human body is made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium. That's the human body, but it turns out that that ratio doesn't vary across life very much. So you can consider microbes to be pretty similar to that. About approximately 99% of their biomass will be made out of those 6 elements. 0.85% by weight is made of potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. And we would consider those micronutrients. And then 0.15% by weight can be attributed to what we call trace minerals or trace elements. There's about 19 of them. So there's about 19 other elements that make up the final 0.15% of the human body. And like I said, these are numbers found for the human body. Every different species is going to have slightly different percentages in terms of their elemental makeup, but it doesn't vary that much. It's all going to be approximately the same. So just because an element is a micronutrient or a trace element, it doesn't mean it's not important. So you can get really severe, dietary disorders from a lack of micronutrients or trace minerals. And that's because even though they're needed in very small abundance, you definitely need to have that small amount of them to function properly. And we'll talk about why in this lecture. So carbon. We've talked about carbon a lot. So let's talk about why organisms need carbon. Carbon is the building block for all cellular structures. So the main elements that we talk about when we talk about the molecules of life in prereqs and things like that, we talk about lipids, which are, those hydrocarbons. We talk about, so hydrocarbons are just molecules that are mostly just made up of carbon and hydrogen, and those are hydrophobic. Carbohydrates, which are sugars or one sugar by itself or sugars linked up in chains to make starches and glycogens and things like that. Carbohydrate is anything made out of sugar. Proteins. We've talked about proteins already, so those are amino acids linked up together in strings. And DNA or RNA, those are nucleic acids. So all of those molecules that are essential for life are carbon-based, right? And that's because carbon has this really stable geometry that makes it possible to make a wide diversity of structures that are fairly stable in terms of their geometry. And it's not just these 4, in terms of organic molecules that are essential to the cell. We also have other molecules like like vitamins and things like that, and those are all going to be carbon-based as well. All right, why do organisms need nitrogen? So you know that when you fertilize your soils, you need to add nitrogen in your fertilizer. But why? And it's not just plants that need nitrogen. We need nitrogen too, but we get it from our food. Well, if you just look at these, an example of a few molecules that you're familiar with, here's an amino acid, amino acids are strung together to build proteins like enzymes and portals into and out of the cell, things like that. So you string these together in these long, long chains, and every single amino acid has an amino group, which is nitrogen. So you have nitrogen, carbon, carbon, nitrogen, carbon, carbon, nitrogen, carbon, carbon, hundreds or thousands of these linked together. So obviously nitrogen is important for all the proteins in your body. And then again, nucleic acids, they've got the sugar phosphate backbone plus a nitrogenous base. The nitrogenous bases are the A's, T's, G's, and C's of the genetic code. They're called nitrogenous bases because they have nitrogen in them. So those are just some examples. Nitrogen are on almost all organic molecules in the body, but those are some major examples of where they're used as a building block. So if you don't have nitrogen, you can't build those molecules that are essential for life. Phosphorus, we've seen phosphorus a lot, and here's again some familiar examples. So ATP, we just finished talking about a whole lot. So there's the adenosine part and then the triphosphate, the 3 phosphate groups. Obviously, you can't have adenosine triphosphate without phosphorus in the center of each of those phosphate groups. And then again in the genetic code, phosphorus shows up a lot. It's one of the repeating subunits, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, for that backbone it's 6 feet of this in every cell in your body. So if you don't have phosphorus, you can't build your genetic material. And again, these are not the only examples of where you find these elements. These are just some familiar examples to you that we've talked about a lot already in the course. So why do organisms need oxygen? Well, oxygen is an element in all the macromolecules in the previous slide. So macro means large. So a macromolecule is a large molecule like, again, the genetic code. So there's oxygen in all these sugars. There's oxygen in the phosphate groups. There's oxygen in the nitrogenous bases. There's oxygen in, there's the carboxyl group for the repeating subunit in proteins. So again, sugar, you even have oxygen in a lot of lipids. So like this is a phospholipid from the phospholipid bilayer. That's filled with oxygens. So oxygen is an essential element. And then of course, for aerobic organisms like us, atmospheric oxygen or dioxide is the final electron acceptor, and that allows aerobic respiration to take place. So that's a final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. It removes those spent electrons. Without atmospheric oxygen, those spent electrons get backed up and the electron transport chain grinds to a halt and you don't get ATP production. So in that case, it's not that oxygen, atmospheric oxygen does not get worked into the molecules or the structural materials of the cell, right? It's just picking up those spent electrons. It picks up some hydrogens with it to become water, and then it just becomes the water in the cell. So it's not a structural component, but it's still essential, obviously, for life, for organisms that use aerobic respiration. Sulfur is one of those macronutrients, or macro again meaning large, so needed in large amounts. So some amino acids use sulfur, and I have some examples here. So remember we talked about how amino acids, they have these repeating subunits, which is the amino group, the carboxyl group, amino group, carboxyl group, and those are linked up together in these long chains. But then they also have those side chains, the R groups, that vary. That's what makes each amino acid unique from all the other amino acids. So some of those side chains use sulfur, and those sulfur groups, especially these sulfhydryl groups, the SHs, these are really essential for preserving the three-dimensional structure of a protein because they form covalent bonds with other amino acids with sulfhydryl groups. And covalent bonds are the strongest bond type. And so those are the least likely to denature under high temperatures or pHs that are outside of the typical range. So those are really essential for maintaining the integrity of the three-dimensional structure of an enzyme. A lot of vitamins have sulfur in them as well. So you don't need sulfur as much as you need carbon. It doesn't show up as much as carbon, but if you don't have any, it's just as bad because your body won't be able to build these essential structures without it, even though it's not needed in as large quantities. All right, so let's talk about micronutrients and trace minerals. So some examples would be iron, zinc, molybdenum, copper. Often these kinds of things are cofactors, and a cofactor is an element or a small molecule that's required for some enzymes to function properly. They're not technically a part of the enzyme. They're not, part of that amino acid chain that's bound to the larger enzyme structure. It's a separate molecule or even just one element, a lone element like iron. But when they bind to some piece of the enzyme, they make the enzyme work. So the enzyme can't work without it. So vitamin C is like that too. Vitamin C is not a trace mineral because it's a vitamin. So vitamins are large carbon-based molecules. An element is just one atom by itself, of a certain kind of atom. So we're talking about these trace minerals or these trace elements here, but vitamins and trace elements can work the same way. They can be essential for helping an enzyme function properly. So without them, certain enzymes just won't function at all, and that can make you sick because all of the enzymes in your body are essential for maintaining proper health. So we don't usually worry about getting enough trace minerals because they're usually present in the environment in sufficient amounts. We only worry about it when, in extreme cases of malnutrition, right? But if you're eating a fairly normal diet, you're going to get these minerals without even trying because they're in food in larger amounts than you actually use them. So you don't need a lot of them, but you do really, really need them. So if you don't get enough of, if you don't get enough iodine, you can get goiters, so all of these things, if you don't get them at all, they'll cause really bad health problems, but usually it's not a problem under normal conditions. So a growth factor is a molecule, not just an element, not a lone element, but a full molecule made by other organisms, not made by you, but made by other organisms that you eat, but that you can't produce yourself. So these are so they're larger molecules, they're carbon-based molecules, they're organic molecules. So that means that it's a bunch of different elements bound together with covalent bonds that are mostly carbons, carbon backbone. And you need them for health, but you can't synthesize it on your own. So for example, some vitamins we can't synthesize on our own. We have to get them from our diet, like vitamin C. Some animals can produce vitamin C, but so vitamin C is not a cofactor for something like a pig that can make vitamin C on its own. We can't make our own vitamin C, so it's considered a growth factor for us. We have to eat vitamin C in order to get it. And again, it's going to function much like these cofactors that we just talked about because vitamin C is needed for certain enzymes to function properly. It binds to an outside portion of the enzyme to make the enzyme work, and the enzyme won't work without it. All right, so that's nutrition. And like I said, nutrition for every organism is going to be slightly different. Every organism is going to have slightly different elemental ratios in its body that it needs to maintain by acquiring these elements from the environment. Different organisms are going to need different vitamins or different growth factors. But the microbes in our body are very similar to us. So they might have slightly different needs than we have, but the reason they're in your body is because they're there to scavenge the nutrients of your body. So they're going to have very similar needs to your needs. So when we're talking about pathogens or other kinds of symbiotic microbes, mutualists, you can expect that their nutritional requirements are going to be fairly similar to your nutritional requirements.